Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Greener Industries for Growing Economies, Insights from the Experts. My name is Benjamin Smith. I'm a Senior Knowledge Management Officer at the Green Growth Knowledge Platform. We're glad to be hosting today's webinar, where we'll gain 3 expert perspectives on the future of green industry. First, we feature a new report that showcases the findings of GGKP, the Global Green Growth Institute, and their economic and social impacts of greening the industrial sector in Cambodia. We'll also highlight the Green Industrial Policy Report from the UN Partnership for Action on a Green Economy, also known as UN PAGE. Finally, we'll present the Practitioner's Guide to Strategic Green Industrial Policy, also from UN PAGE, which provides comprehensive guidance to policymakers for greening industry. However, before introducing the moderator for today's event, I'd like to make a few quick announcements. The GGKP will be hosting our 6th annual conference taking place in Paris from November 27th through 29th in conjunction with the OECD's Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum. This year's theme will be Inclusive Solutions for the Green Economy Transition, and will focus on issues around competitiveness, jobs, reskilling, and social equity. Earlier that week at the OECD, from November 26th through 27th, the GGKP will be co-sponsoring the 2nd Forum on Green Economy Learning, along with UN PAGE, the OECD, GGKP, Environment for Development, and the Green Economy Coalition. For more information on both events, please visit the GGKP web platform. Finally, I'd like to highlight a few logistics. First, we strongly encourage participants to raise questions throughout the webinar. This can be done by typing your questions into the chat box, which can be found on the right-hand side of the webinar dashboard. Webinar presenters will answer these questions in the Q&A session. After the webinar, we'll be circulating a 5-minute survey. We request that you take the time to complete it. It provides the GGKP with valuable feedback and will shape our future webinars. If you have any technical issues, please email us at contact@ggkp.org and we'll help you troubleshoot. Finally, please note that all of the presentations you see here today, as well as the recording of the webinar, will be available on the GGKP website tomorrow. There's a wealth of resources related to green industry on our website at ggkp.org under the sectors and theme pages, including all of the reports referenced here today. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Eva Zabay. Eva leads the World Business Council on Sustainable Development's work on natural, social, and human capital measurement. She led the WBCSD's consortium on that developed the Natural Capital Protocol on behalf of the Natural Capital Coalition. Over 13 years at WBCSD, she's also led initiatives as diverse as the Global Water Tool and a Natural Capital short film series. She delivered a TEDx talk in 2012 on valuing nature and business, which I might add, I watched earlier today, and it was an excellent introduction to the importance of natural capital to business and society. So Eva, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, and it's my great pleasure to turn the digital podium over to you.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thank you for the opportunity to moderate this panel. I'm really looking forward to exploring with everyone, the questions that were raised, like what policies help drive green industry and what sectors have the most to gain from greener industrial practices. And do we have examples of successes? And we'll hear about some of them as well. So I'm really delighted to introduce this fantastic panel to you. They are really recognized experts in the field. And if you have a look at their bios, you'll understand why I'm saying that. So please don't hesitate to ask questions, and even very challenging questions to them as we go through today's webinar. So I'm going to start off by introducing Andrea, and I'll introduce Tilghman and Nimi later on before they present. But you've got their titles up here on the screen in front of you. So Andrea, essentially, from what I can figure out, has at least 3 hats. He wears at least 3 hats, and he's the founder and CEO of Knowledge SRL, an excellent consultancy in the area. He's an extraordinary person and an extraordinary associate professor of system dynamics modeling. And the third hat is that he's an associate at the IISD, which is the International Institute for Sustainable Development. So he wears 3 hats, probably at least 3 times my brain power, as he basically has written the modeling chapter of UNEP's Green Economy report and has written manuals and guidelines documents on the use of indicators and models for green economy analysis. So enough about that. He's going to tell us all about the work done in Cambodia on the impacts of greening the industrial sector. And just as a little kind of fun fact about Andrea that is not in his bio, is that he's once been called an enviro-socialist by a politician, which although may have been directed as a criticism, he actually quite liked. So over to you, Andrea, take it away.
Thank you, Eva. So I'm very pleased to be with you today to give an overview of this study about the economic, social, and environmental impacts of greening the industrial sector in Cambodia. This work was very recently finished and released just about yesterday morning. So the background of the study is that the industrial sector in Cambodia is a driver for economic growth, employment creation, and poverty reduction. This is clearly stated in industrial development policy and in the development plans that we see at the country level. What we see also in the industrial development policy and national discussions is that there is a need for modernizing the industrial sector, moving from a labor-intensive industry to a skill-based industry where there is an integration of local businesses into global and regional supply chains. So basically, the goal is to try and move up to higher value products that deliver more opportunities for the local population and local enterprises. What we see in this study is that economic modeling can provide useful inputs to estimating what is the potential for greening or strengthening the performance of the industrial sector. So what was done in the context of this project was to create a system dynamics model, or using an integrated approach for forecasting the performance of the sector that would focus on the impacts of having a more resource efficient approach to these sectors. And we focus on 4. We focus on food processing, brick manufacturing, garment manufacturing, and electronics. Now, this was done in different ways. So we tried to look at different strategies that could support the sectors. And as a result, we ended up working with several stakeholders at the country level that would share their opinion about what would be, say, the main opportunities for industry. So we looked at the potential to increase exports as a first step. We looked at the potential to improve labor productivity, and so reduce labor intensity. This is through mechanization, through new processes. And then we looked at the potential to improve energy efficiency, also through fuel switching, so addressing the need for more modern forms of energy and so on. And then water and material efficiency as next steps, meaning water use could be more efficient. And then at the same time, we could use less inputs to produce the same outputs, so reducing material inputs and waste at the same time. Then we also looked at the potential to increase wastewater treatment. So not only, as I said before, or in the previous cases, at improving the efficiency of the process, but also in reducing the impact of the production process on the environment in this case. And finally, adopting renewable energy as a strategy to reduce the use of fossil fuels, as well as reduce emissions overall. So basically supporting on-site production of electricity. In terms of the results, what we see is that the introduction of these type of interventions in the sectors would allow to increase GDP. So this is, from a societal point of view, is an important contribution to the economy of the country. And you see here in these slides the potential contribution that we see for the government sector, up to 46%, electronics 35.5%, and so on. So this is one of the main concerns of the government, that is looking for information and some sort of estimates to see what is happening with the sectors and what might happen, in that these investments do deliver economic growth. On the other hand, these sectors also show some decoupling, in a way that economic growth is followed by job creation, but simultaneously we see a reduction in emissions, in greenhouse gas emissions generation. So we start seeing that improvement of resource efficiency as in energy, directly reducing emissions, as in water, for instance, we reduce the cost and, for instance, the energy used for water treatment, all contribute to reducing emissions, and as one of the proxies for environmental performance, show that growing decoupling between economic growth and environmental impacts. Of course, the impacts change depending on the sectors, depending on their carbon intensity in terms of production processes, but overall, we see this trend emerging from the analysis. Now, what this means for companies, and so far we've talked about macro indicators like GDP, employment, and emissions. What this means for companies is that there is an increase in productivity emerging from the implementation of these investments. On average, we see a productivity increase of up to 80% when we measure productivity as GDP divided by material inputs. In other words, the value added that is created through the use of certain production inputs like energy and water and other material inputs. And the values that we obtain depend on the sector and the material intensity or the input intensity of these processes. So what you can see in this slide is the performance for the 4 industrial sectors with the different columns that are color-coded for energy productivity on the left side, for instance, in blue, and then water productivity in green. So you can see that overall, we have an increase in productivity, meaning that the value of production actually increases for each unit of input that we use. Now, this is important for the companies because it translates very practically in a reduction of production cost. In other words, if in order to produce the same type of output from the government sector or bricks, we consume less energy, then the cost of energy would have a smaller incidence in the total cost of production. And so we see that food processing, for instance, achieves a 21% reduction in production costs, electronics at 18, bricks 17, and garment 12%. So this is an important indicator to show that this approach delivers both for companies in terms of economic performance, but also for society at the societal level in terms of GDP. Now, the outcomes of these interventions seem good. I mean, we see that growing decoupling, we see that increased competitiveness for the sectors. But what about the investments and the potential return on investment? So we estimated the total investment required for achieving these targets. We also look at the potential profit for companies. And if we take, again, a more of a systemic approach with what we call more of an integrated cost-benefit analysis or extended cost-benefit analysis, we see that the investments required are actually fairly small compared to the benefits that they're going to generate. So in this graph, you can see that the investment required upfront for these interventions, it's actually pretty small, and the outcomes are 6.7 times larger on average. And this includes both the firm level avoided cost and increased revenue or value generated by these interventions, as well as the societal level avoided costs. And we see that a lot of the returns in this case actually emerge because of that societal return, meaning we reduce pollution, we reduce health costs, and so on and so forth. Now, the payback time, which is a very important indicator for companies, just considering the firm level avoided cost, is in the range of 2 to 3 years, depending on the type of interventions. In some cases, it's even less than 6 months. So some of the interventions that we have tested are very, very direct returns in the very short term. So what would it take to make this happen? And that's sort of the process that we followed throughout the study. We looked at first the performance of the sectors under a baseline scenario. We simulated these alternative cases where we can test what happens if we improve energy efficiency and material efficiency and so on and so forth. What is the value generated for the companies and for society? For instance, when we increase wastewater treatment, there is no actual value generated for companies, but there is value to society in that case because we reduce pollution and the impact for the people living around the industries or where they're located. So once we have estimated what are these returns for society and for companies, the next step was to assess what are the type of policies that we can implement to make this happen. So it is very important that we looked at the benefits for companies and for society to figure out what is the right type of policy. For instance, if there is a benefit for everyone, both for companies and society, and the return on investment is very high, meaning there is a very short payback time, then standards could be implemented. That's because we see that there are clear winners and everyone stands to win from that intervention, and the investment can be paid back quickly. So implementing a standard simply allows companies to be aware of what are the advantages and then act. If instead we see that there may be a high upfront cost for some of these interventions, incentives as a cost sharing mechanism could be the option to go for, meaning that if we see that both the government saves money and the private sector stands to gain more out of GDP or revenues overall and reduction of costs, then it makes sense that the costs are shared to make sure that there is allocation of investments that is consistent with the benefits that are accrued. Then, of course, we see also that skills development is essential across the board, both for the awareness raising of the potential to improve the process, the industrial process, but also to make sure that the skills are in place to make these changes happen. Before or beyond what is the level of awareness. We have to be aware, but at the same time, we have to be able to implement these changes over time. So you find a lot more information in the study about the specific ranges for the extent to which incentives could be provided. We calculated what were the values that could be considered to be reasonable for different types of interventions on energy, on waste and water, and so on and so forth, on labor, to see what could be the potential contribution of the government to reducing the burden for these companies overall. And so I would like to thank you for your attention and mention very briefly that this work was carried out in close collaboration with several country partners, including we had consultations with several ministries, several experts, with industrial associations, and we see the potential to expand this work, and that's something we tried to address early on in the process, to work with spatial economic zones, for instance, where we can find not only opportunities for one industry, but actually more opportunities emerging from having a cluster of industries coming together to make use of the synergies of reusing water, for instance, to reduce the burden on others or costs, or to make use of waste as an output, as a resource for another company, and so on and so forth. And more of this work we see as being emerging. Again, GGKP is working in this direction also in Indonesia. So we see strong potential for this type of assessments, and we hope that this modeling exercise actually help shed some light on the opportunities for the industries and maybe fill some gaps in terms of data and evidence that may be lacking in very specific settings like the context of Cambodia. So thank you very much, and I hope there is an opportunity to exchange more, and I look forward to receiving your questions.
Thanks so much. Don't leave yet, Andrea. We have quite a few questions coming in, and we can maybe address a couple of them now and come back to a few of them that relate to the whole area we can come to at the end of the webinar. But one is, did you assess even the well-being of local populations after the project implementation? And that linked to something I was wondering about, which was, sure, an increase in GDP, but how are those benefits distributed? So perhaps you could comment on that first, Pete.
Yes, so these projects are mostly, or say the ambition for improving the performance of the sector is more exploratory. So we're not looking at ex post, what happened after the project was implemented. Nevertheless, we worked off some case studies to parameterize the model and carry out the analysis. And what we can see in terms of the distributional impacts and impacts for society as opposed to companies is the extent to which society is impacted by production processes. So to a certain extent, we looked at wastewater and now the fact that untreated wastewater discharge would affect health outcomes. We looked at emissions and the impact of air pollution on labor productivity in Phnom Penh, for instance. And we calculated the economic value of these, say, ecosystem services, or the impact of production that is taking place and how it affects households. And so that is reflected in the societal cost. So we are looking at both the localized impacts of production on the people living around the area, as well as the impact for the government as the cost of providing the health services that would be required as a result of these impacts. So we tried to take that societal approach to actually show that there is more value created than what is the value created for the companies.
I think it's something that we face also as we work with major companies on how to measure and value environmental and social impacts, is that in monetary terms, you end up using economic estimates and different valuation techniques. And sometimes there's a communication step that needs to happen to make sure everyone's on the same page with what these monetary values actually represent. So I think that's any reaction to that?
Well, we tried to make a close connection between the environmental impact and actually costs, actual costs for companies. So when it comes to water and energy efficiency, we connected that to the balance sheet and see by how much your total cost would decline. But also for the government, when we talk about health and wastewater treatment, we looked at what is the cost for the government to address health issues and how that shows up in the annual budget, and by how much that could be reduced if the industry moved in one direction as opposed to another direction. It's something that made it more material to them and more relevant in a way. The issue here being that the investment may be centralized in a few hands, but the benefits are shared with thousands, if not millions of people, depending on the type of intervention we look at. With the extra complication that we started from case studies, but we wanted to generalize and look at the 4 subsectors from a national perspective, where some of these impacts are actually very local. So we had to compromise a little bit on the data and how we use them to come up with that national level estimate for the subsectors. But what was crucial was to link this avoided environmental and social impact to actual cost items. So that avoided cost and extra benefits was something critical for us to get more of the ownership actually being created for the process and more support over time.
So actual cost avoided. One more question, and then we'll move on to Tilghman. So one question for you, Andrea. What in particular areas of investment were focused on in terms of food processing? Was there a focus on the mechanization of food processing?
Well, to a certain extent, yes. So the process of developing the scenarios was based on a selection of sectors that was based on priorities at the country level, but also a selection of interventions that was based on what is feasible, what is economical, what is being done in other countries, and so on and so forth. So the higher value creation, that is what the industrial development policy or plan highlights, is that we need to move to more mechanization, make the process more effective, reduce waste in the process, and food waste in the process, which has different impacts. It may reduce the labor intensity, but at the same time, it increases the productivity and profitability of the process. So we looked at both the technologies that can reduce, say, the energy use, changing light bulbs, for instance, as a starting point, but also those more transformative investments that help you modernize the production process to actually step up and have higher quality for products reaching higher value markets and so on and so forth. So that was one of the areas. The mechanization was one of the areas that we looked at as a potential intervention.
Great, thank you so much, Andrea, and we'll come back to you at the end of the webinar for more discussion. And now it's really my pleasure to introduce Tilghman Altonburg. And Tilghman is a very influential person because he works at the German Development Institute, which is Germany's think tank for development policy. And he serves as a frequent advisor to the German government, as well as international development agencies. So Tilghman has written many articles and done lots of research on issues such as competitiveness, industrial and innovation policy. He's also done research on SME promotion and value chain development. But one thing you might not know is that his first piece of research was on frogs. So with that, I'm handing over to you, Tilghman. We're going to hear about policies for a green transition in developing countries, which is also one of the questions that has come up. So please, over to you, Tilghman. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Eva. So I'm not going to talk about frogs today, but about policies for green transformation. It's a pleasure to be with you. So what I'm going to present is a joint report we produced last year with PAGE, which has already been introduced, a kind of joint venture of 5 international organizations with the German Development Institute. And I'm going to start with this slide, which many of you will probably know, which really shows the challenge the report is facing with, the report is addressing. What you can see here is on the x-axis the level of human development, and on the y-axis the resources used per capita. And if you look at the bottom horizontal line, which says world biocapacity per person in 2011, what you see here is that all these yellow dots and some of the black dots here are clearly below the threshold line. And that means that all these economies that are yellow and black here below the line are living within the planetary boundaries in terms of their biocapacity, but they all happen to be at low levels of human development, whereas on the right-hand side, all these blue dots there, they are kind of in the range of high human development, but they are all exceeding clearly kind of the resource availability per person. So all economies of the world should, in principle, be in that quadrant on the bottom right side, but there's not a single country is really represented there. So that shows that there seems to be a very strong trade-off between becoming rich and using the share of resources that is available for everyone. So green industrial policy is basically about moving economies into this blue quadrant on the bottom right here. And this is obviously challenging because not a single economy worldwide so far has achieved it. The next graph is more encouraging. So what it shows here is that the green economic transformation is indeed underway. What we see here is the dark green line that's going down shows the share of fossil fuel-based electricity generation or investment in fossil fuel-based electricity generation. And as we see, it has gone down from 85% or so at the turn of the century to now about 40%, whereas at the same time, the share in renewables investment has gone up from 15 to about 60 or so. And this is these are the worldwide figures. It's not just the rich countries, it's worldwide. So this is a very rapid transformation that we have rarely experienced in the world. So in the electricity sector, clearly the point in time where fossil fuels will disappear has been reached, and where renewables are clearly more competitive in many locations, and the trend is very clear. And what's behind this is what we see here, which has been called Swansons Law, which shows the cost degression as economies of scale increase. What we see here is that for the case of PV modules, in 40 years, from 1976 to 2016, the costs of one PV module have gone down from $100 to about 36 cents. No? A really radical 300 times decrease of cost within 40 years. And this is just because of technological progress and because of production in large scales. And the same is happening for various technologies. So, and that means that these renewable technologies become cost competitive with polluting technologies if we kind of invest in driving the cost curve down. The same is happening with lithium-ion batteries for cars. And within about, I don't know, 10 years time or so, the total cost of ownership of an electric vehicle will be comparable to the total cost of ownership of a traditional internal combustion engine vehicles. And at that point in time, basically the dissemination curve of electric vehicles will kind of really skyrocket, because then it will be the cheaper option. And we are clearly on that in that trend already. So not all sectors have this positive development, but what I want to show here is that the green economic transformation is not something desirable that people in the north are talking about, but something that is really happening and that countries should prepare for. Now that takes me to the topic of this report, which is industrial policy, which we define as a set of measures that governments use to influence a country's economic structure, not to increase company profits or so, but in the pursuit of a desired objective. And that objective would then not only be defined in terms of GDP growth, but in terms of a broader kind of sustainability targets like the ones laid down in the SDG agenda. Now, industrial policy, what I'm going to show is why industrial policy is needed despite some of these encouraging trends. The government has an important role in pushing these things for various reasons. What we understand by industrial policy is not kind of a bureaucrat with a 10-year plan telling investors what to do, but a kind of modern understanding of industrial policy that is based on facilitating stakeholder dialogues, bringing people together, managing coordination failures, creating consensus on development pathways, adopting then regulatory framework and set incentives for private investors to really invest in the right things. So it's nothing about a kind of bureaucratic monster that we are thinking about. And as the economies worldwide are shifting away from a world run on fossil fuels and resource depletion to kind of more sustainable ways of production, as shown in the electricity and electric mobility cases, this is happening, and smart industrial policy, that's a key message of the report in a way, is about anticipating where markets go and adapting your national economies to the global market trends. The global market trends is in many sectors really going green. So even for low-income countries, that is a latecomer to the global market, it makes sense to understand where the global economy is moving and anticipating what markets will look like in 10 or 20 years' time. Now, part of the report is discussing how green industrial policy is different from traditional industrial policies. And what we argue here is that many principles are the same. That's why we have this little T-shirt here in the corner about same, but different, because it's different in 6 ways. There are 6 additional challenges that I want to briefly discuss here. The first is, in addition to the traditional instruments of industrial policy, infant industry protection and R&D support and so on, one key thing, maybe the most important, is to internalize environmental costs. And that can be done through taxes or through cap and trade systems. And this is a key element. Some economists say just get the environmental prices right, just have a carbon tax, for example, and everything else will fall in place. The report does not agree, because firstly, there are political economy challenges that prevent people from really having a high carbon price. And also there are other market failures in R&D, for example, that need to be tackled. So it's not all, but it's maybe a large part of the story. The second is that in green industrial policy, we're distinguishing between good and bad technologies from the very beginning. Traditionally, one would say the government supports a new sector until it becomes competitive, but then the government withdraws and leaves it to the competition in the marketplace, which technologies basically wins the market. But here we know that we want to phase out certain things that are harmful, and we want to phase in things that are good. And that means that we can need to kind of invest much more in that kind of transition, and even, for example, provide subsidies for green and clean technologies, even when they're already cost competitive, to just accelerate the diffusion. And that leads me to the next step. There's an urgency to act, especially with regard to climate change, where we need to change things substantially in the next 15 years to avoid overstepping the Earth's biocapacity. And that means big push, acceleration is a key principle here. That means we cannot just wait and experiment a bit and leave it to market actors alone to experiment slowly with cleaner solutions, but we need to accelerate things with, for example, R&D missions for key technologies, which we will be key for achieving our goals, like energy storage, smart grids, and so on. Then another difference is that we have longer time horizons for the transformation, and that creates increased uncertainty. And that means that governments need to provide investors with a kind of 10, 20, 30 years secure investment perspective. And we need 2 inputs for that: a societal agreement on long-term roadmaps, and then policy incentives like feed-in tariffs or so that that guarantee a certain price or offtake guarantee for the next 20 years. Fifth, there are additional policy interfaces. More ministries need to be coordinated. And sixth, we are in many cases dealing with global commons like climate, oceans, biodiversity. So national industrial policies alone will not solve the things. We need some international policy coordination. So in sum, there's deeper market failure. There are many entrenched societal values involved. And there's unprecedented urgency, which call for a stronger role of government. Now, this then the problem is that usually governments are driven by economic agendas rather than environmental agendas. They need to demonstrate the economic co-benefits so we need to demonstrate the economic co-benefits of greening to really convince our stakeholders. And there are some reasons kind of discussed in the report. Clearly, the first one is the strongest argument. If you kill the planet, you don't have an economy, basically. But that may not be convincing for a politician with a 4-year term, electoral term. But there are other things like fiscal benefits, for example, by taxing environmental bads, for example, you not only steer investment into cleaner sectors, but you also increase your revenue. You can reduce the vulnerability to oil price shocks. You can get access to international green funds. You can have positive effects in the labor markets. It's tricky to measure, but there are some sectors where the green option is clearly more labor intensive than the brown option, for example, in organic agriculture, in circular economy, in renewables. And another big argument is also to avoid switching costs. So investing today in a coal-fired power plant would be definitely bad investment in economic terms. And then final point here I would like to address is we are doing a lot of research in the GGKP research committee on trade and competitiveness on case studies where we can show that countries, even developing countries, can enhance their competitiveness by using green alternatives. For example, using product differentiation through green labels, showing productivity improvements, as Andreas' presentation has shown earlier on, developing new products and developing knowledge spillovers. For example, one research shows that clean patents have more citations, which is a proxy for knowledge spillover, which are higher than in brown technologies. So I have a few examples here of country case studies, but I will leave that for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tilghman. That was very interesting to get into some of the detail, and I can tell that in the chat, the people on the line some people want to get into even more detail. So if I can ask you just a few questions before we then go on to Nimi. And one of them was, you've mentioned a few of the technologies that will help lead to the green transition, but can you give us, in your opinion, what some of the most important and impactful technology advancements will make the biggest difference?
Well, firstly, I think one challenge is to first clean up the energy sector. And once we have clean energy, then to electrify other sectors downstream. No? So, for example, starting with the traffic industry. So as long as the energy sector is still polluting, you just transfer the problem. So an electric vehicle that gets its electricity from a coal-fired power plant will pollute as much as a traditional car. So kind of electricity sector is the first thing to do. And then electrifying other sectors is the second thing to do. And then I think for developing countries in particular, agriculture matters a lot, because many, or if not most, of the greenhouse gas emissions, for example, but also other environmental problems related to overuse of water, soil, fertility, etc., are agriculture related. So moving to new forms of agriculture that are more organic, that are not tilling as much as possible, that use less chemical fertilizers, etc., but at the same time are productive and socially inclusive. That is, I think, for developing countries, probably the most important thing to do. And then also urban air pollution, clearly something that is coming up increasingly, and where people really see, and we have the big air pollution conference this day, so it's much in the press, where I think we're talking about 7 million premature deaths per year or so. So this is also something that is very clearly visible, and that is where voters, electorates, constituency press for innovation, because the suffering and the effects are clearly visible and direct.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. One quite interesting question, I think, was about the potential rebound effect of increasing efficiency of process manufacturing and all the technologies, and then as a result, people just using more of them. How do you deal with possible rebound effects due to these efficiency measures?
Well, that is a difficult question. I think in the rich countries, clearly we need to rethink our consumption patterns. It's difficult to tell people in low-income countries to change their consumption patterns. At least I wouldn't do so. And we have for example, a research project going on now on consumption patterns of emerging global middle classes. So what can be done to avoid that the billions of people who are kind of entering over the next decades, the middle classes, emulate the type of consumption patterns we have in the North, which is clearly unsustainable. So, but without kind of colonialist attitude of kind of, we don't want you to consume what we have been consuming in the North. So clearly change here must come from the advanced economies, and there are certain things moving, but of course far too slow so far. The other part is technology, but I don't think so. So certain things can be done with technology. So for example, just assume that we have electricity generated from solar energy resources, and then we electrify all our transport modes with clean solar energy, then basically we can still increase consumption to a certain extent. But I think these two things need to go together, no? Changing consumption patterns and improving technology. And I'm pretty sure that the technology side alone will not be sufficient. And it depends from sector to sector. How much will be the technology part of the solution, and how much will be the kind of changing consumption patterns part of the solution?
Thank you. That's very helpful. And one final question linked directly to some of the aspects you were alluding to around certification. And one question around, could you provide some examples of effective certification schemes and one point here is that Sri Lanka is now working on the development of a green industry certification scheme. So if you had any remarks or suggestions or information to share on that, please.
Okay. Well, it depends a bit on the sector. I think you need to have certifications for. Certifications are clearly something that makes markets more transparent. And we need to show consumers must be able to distinguish between a forest resource that has been produced sustainably and one that comes from virgin rainforests, for example. And that applies to everything, to fish stocks and to textile production and to cars and household appliances and so on. So I think we need to have certification schemes here, and there are interesting cases of. I think the difficulty is to phase them in, because what you need is action at various fronts. Firstly, to change government incentives to make kind of, for example, to make it mandatory to show that your electric device is high or medium or low energy efficient. To make that kind of labeling mandatory could be one thing. The second is then to have a market of energy consultants working with companies, the small enterprises, for example, for which again you need to train these people and you need to create awareness among the SMEs to use these principles, and you need to have kind of credibility of the standards. So there need to be kind of mechanisms that clearly make sure that standards are not just greenwashing standards. So I think in all sectors, certification is an important thing. It requires sometimes complex systems, monitoring system, labs, testing facilities, verification schemes. But I think it is one of the key elements to do. In addition to environmental pricing, I think standards is maybe the second most important thing to do.
Thank you, that's very clear. Thanks, Tilghman. And so you'll come back for the end panel. So the next, it's really my pleasure to introduce Ozunimi Iti. Nimi is a project manager in the Environment Department of the UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization in Vienna. Nimi coordinates UNIDO's efforts under the PAGE, the Partnership for Action on Green Economy and the Green Industry Initiative, as well as managing the implementation of various multilateral environmental agreement projects. So it's really my pleasure to hand over to Nimi. Nimi's going to tell us about the Practitioner's Guide to Strategic Green Industrial Policy. And one fun fact about Nimi is that she really likes spicy food, and this is going to be, she's going to spice up this conversation by telling us some concrete, practical guidance with everyone on the line. So over to you, Nimi, and thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today to not only spice up the webinar, but also to talk about the Practitioner's Guide to Strategic Green Industrial Policy, which is a UN PAGE publication produced as part of a Green Industrial Policy trilogy. So I'm going to present in 3 parts. I will first talk about the conceptual framework of strategic green industrial policy, including a summary of what the publication is about, green industry and principles of strategic green industrial policy. Then I'll go into the phases of SGIP development, and then we'll have a short look at some tools used in developing SGIP. So firstly, the Practitioner's Guide to Strategic Green Industrial Policy was produced to create a resource for policy practitioners to be able to find quick information on green industrial policy, but also to get a methodology and useful tools that could be employed in the planning and implementation of green industrial policies. The guide includes a main report and also a supplement which goes into more detail on some of the multiple tools that could be used in developing green industrial policies. The intended audience for this guide is mainly policy practitioners and researchers. So at UNIDO, we distinguish between 2 strands of green industrialization. So first of all, there's the green of existing industries. So for example, your regular SME or large industry, if you instituted some kind of IT payment system, that would be a simple way of introducing of greening that industry. But then we also look at creating new green industries. So, for example, the design of some kind of green renewable energy product, for example, that would be under that heading. So we can first start by defining green industrial policy. To us, this is an industrial policy that is meant to trigger or facilitate structural changes as entailed or required, both to respond to environmental conditions or situations and to develop a green circular economy. And we could ask, why are we talking about strategic green industrial policy? Well, we say that it's strategic because there is a conscious effort to depart from the present unsustainable path to a more sustainable path. Traditional industrial policy often evolves over time, whereas with green industrial policy, we cannot afford this evolution by trial and error. So conscious strategic choices have to be made in order to move away from the unsustainable ways to more sustainable ways. And these strategic choices must conform with general system and ecosystem principles. And of course, we need SGIP to cope with the tremendous changes in which we as humans are interacting with the environment and stretching the limits of the planet, and also to mitigate the externalities from manufacturing and consumption of products. SGIP is built on a conceptual framework where it embeds the manufacturing industry in a green economy environment. So this implies that we would leapfrog from the traditional linear path of industrialization, which is basically make and waste. And SGIP acknowledges that the manufacturing industry cannot be viewed in isolation from other policies and sectors. So we have to look at multiple levels. And in addition, SGIP puts gender mainstreaming into the forefront. So in the publication, we are shown 6 different phases of SGIP development. First of all, there has to be a high-level vision coming from the very top, where there are very specific goals which can be easily communicated to stakeholders. For example, this could be a particular percentage reduction in carbon emissions. And then after this phase of developing this high-level vision, stock-taking exercise would have to be carried out among stakeholders. And there is a feedback between this stock-taking exercise and also to the level of the people making the high-level vision. After the stock-taking, then you go into prioritizing intervention areas. And these intervention areas could be sectoral, they could be thematic, they could even be regional. And now, just to mention that while all of the phases are going through, you would have continuous stakeholder consultation, capacity building, monitoring and evaluation, and gender mainstreaming. All these issues go throughout the different phases of SGIP development. So after phase 3, prioritizing intervention areas, then policy domains and instruments would have to be selected based on the socio-economic status of the country in question. And from there, these domains and instruments would have to be analyzed for their impact, and then a policy pathway designed. So once the intervention areas have been selected, domains and instruments have also been developed, and there is a clear pathway, then this provides a strong basis for implementation of strategic green industrial policy. One aspect which is really highlighted by the publication is the importance of identifying stakeholders for SGIP. The tool on the screen helps the practitioner to not just identify the stakeholders, but to also try to understand the relationships between the different stakeholders. And understanding the relationships would help practitioners to be able to know which stakeholders have the most influence, which ones would need more efforts in order to engage them, and also which stakeholders will be crucial for the implementation phase. So, for example, you can see that the dotted lines signify where there are weak or informal relationships, and the lightning bolt signifies where there are frictions or conflicts between potential stakeholders. And the stakeholders are classified from key stakeholders, primary to secondary stakeholders, depending on their level of impact on policy development. For industrial policy development, there needs to be private partnership dialogue between from the top leadership in the government through line ministries and departments, so both inter and intra-ministerial coordination, and between private sector, non-government stakeholders, non-profits, and the public. This is very important to make sure that the private sector is carried along during the development of green industrial policies, because most of these policies would have to be implemented at the level of the private sector. There are some elements to consider when selecting policy domains. Policymakers need to identify the key domain areas that they would like to make interventions first. Then they need to look at policy instruments that could be used in these domains. So examples of the domains could be product. They could decide to focus on a product, on labor, capital issues, land issues, or technology. And then they could decide on policy instruments within those policy domains. So they could look at market-based instruments that focus on price. So for example, using subsidies to influence the market, mandating instruments, for example, environmental regulations. So those would be compulsory regulations, and also voluntary instruments. And then they could apply impact assessments on these instruments to find out how these, the use of these instruments could affect the economy. And some of these assessments include cost-benefit analysis, regulatory impact assessments, poverty and social impact assessments. So you see how these assessments are not only looking at economic aspects, but also we'll be looking at environment and social impacts on the economy. So the practitioner's guide introduces several tools to help practitioners in developing strategic green industrial policy. And then the supplement to the guide goes further to give more detail about how some of these tools can be used. So for example, here we have multiple criteria decisional analysis for understanding potential trade-off between sectors. Here, the economic impacts of a particular policy decision would be looked at against environmental or social constraints. And the policymaker would then be guided on whether to go forward with that particular policy intervention based on whether there are negative or positive economic impacts, or if there are environmental, ecosystem, or social constraints. In addition to this tool, several other tools are highlighted in the publication, including cross-impact matrix, active-passive charts, the material flow analysis, which is used to identify key targets of SGIP, life cycle assessments, and environmentally extended input-output analysis. There are really multiple tools available in this publication, and it's very useful for the practitioners because it enables them to select the tool that is best suited to their own socioeconomic situation. So in conclusion, SGIP is an emerging concept which involves a significant amount of input from a diversity of disciplines and stakeholders, which represents a wide spectrum of interests. Green industrialization requires multiple interventions to be developed and agreed upon by these affected stakeholders. The area of stakeholder engagement is very important in order to make green industrialization successful. It is an ambitious task to bring together all these multiple stakeholders from different disciplines, but it's very necessary in the context of the complex global challenges we face today, such as climate change. The Green Practitioner's Guide can be used to gain practical information on SGIP, but also to acquire detailed guidelines and tools that can be applied to green industrial policy development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nimi. That was very clear and practical, so thank you very much. I had a couple of questions and then we'll invite the other panelists to come back. One was quite pragmatic, which is, will you be carrying out training and workshops to help capacity building on using these guidelines?
What we're doing at the moment with, thanks for that question. What we're doing at the moment in conjunction with other page partners is to try to put the guidelines together in an online training format that could be then made available all over the world, not only to countries that have signed up for the Partnership for Action on Green Economy, but also other policy practitioners and researchers. So I think that would be a great way to reach a wider audience.
Thanks, that makes sense. And another question is, could you please name some developed countries implementing SGIP, or does this concept only apply to the developing world?
Well, I mean, in the developing world, for our countries, we have developed this publication mainly for developing countries. So we've applied it in Peru, Burkina Faso, for example. I couldn't name a particular developed country, but I'm sure that they are in some way implementing strategic green industrial policy. I mean, the European Union, for example, has its circular economy framework that started, I think, a year ago or so. And I think it follows the same nature of strategic green industrial policy development. So it might not have the same name, but I think a lot of developing countries are following the same direction.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting you mentioned circular economy, because that was one of the very early questions that came up in the chat that I was going to raise with the panelists, which was, what are the links between green economy and circular economy, and how can we enhance them in a way that, I suppose, creates more synergy rather than potentially being seen as competing efforts? Do you have any views on that? And then we can invite the others back to join us.
I think that they're very interlinked. Our definition, actually recognizes the circular economy, and we say that a green economy should be circular. There are a lot of conflicting opinions of this. Some people think they are the same thing, basically. Personally, I think that a green economy is a more overarching framework that could include the circular economy and other types of sustainability initiatives like the bioeconomy, for example. However, we have to note as well that the circular economy has different definitions for different countries. So it's difficult to say how exactly they link when the definitions are not the same. But yes, I do think that both issues have to work hand in hand, and really it shouldn't be a competition, really. We should try as much as possible when trying to reach a green economy or strive towards that goal of a green economy. We should understand that that should also be a circular one.
Thanks, that makes a lot of sense. And if I could invite Tilghman and Andrea to join us back, then we can have a go at answering some of the many questions that have been coming through the chat function, which has been great. And there's been very positive remarks also about collaborating and making sure that we connect afterwards. The level of the questions also has been very high quality. So there are some trends though in the questions, and I would like to begin with bridging the developed and developing countries gap. So there were some questions around how do industries in developing countries overcome the initial investment hurdle to reach the point of return on their investments. There's also what roles can foreign direct investment play to help countries implement green industry. Couple more questions under this broader heading is how can green industry help bridge the gap between developing countries and developed countries? And finally, what kind of technologies can most easily be brought over to developing countries? So I gave you a few questions there to think about. And with that overall banner, I thought we could go one by one and get your views on what you would recommend and how you would answer some of those questions. So perhaps starting with you, Andrea, can we please hear your reactions and views to those overall questions, please?
Yes, well, thank you, first of all, for these challenging questions. They're not very easy to answer. They're very context dependent. So in my experience, both with this study and beyond, I would think that the main challenge for developing countries is that if they're fast growing as economies, then you're looking for fast returns as well. And so there is less emphasis on the longer term returns, but there is emphasis on shorter payback times. You can invest in something that leads to a return in 2 years, maybe 3 years, but if the payback time is 5-6 years, then it's not as attractive because we have other investments, real estate and so on and so forth, that may lead to stronger returns. So ultimately, we need to look at the economics of the investment and what it takes to make it happen, which leads to the second question you asked and said, what can bridge the gap between the required investment and actually making it happen, and where FDI comes in, for instance. So what we have done in the Cambodia study was to look at explicitly what are the costs for companies in terms of the investment upfront and operation and maintenance, and what are the avoided costs for the government. So checking exactly how the balance sheet of public accounts will be affected so that the revenues, in a way, that are accrued by the companies or the extra profit could be justified, in a way, by the avoided costs from the government. So a reallocation of the avoided costs from government is a zero net revenue strategy. And being, let's put it this way, so the avoided costs from government being reallocated to support investment and reduce the upfront costs for companies would be a strategy that helps reducing that initial barrier. FDI works in somewhat the same way. So it reduces the burden for the company to raise funding on their own, where problems are not only the actual amount of money, but the cost of financing for these companies. So we see policies like providing support and collateral for some of the loans and so on, reduce the risk and the cost for companies to have access to the right level of financing that they require. overall, I would think that when this happens, you bridge the gap to a certain extent by creating more high-value activities for developing countries. And that's what helps you increase the level of wages and drive more development, drive more of the local engine of growth, rather than being reliant on either exporting resources, mostly raw resources, natural resources, or relying on low-cost production. So it's all part of a process. It's all part of a systemic, assessment that has to be carried out, and there are many different ways to make it happen. In our case, we really focus on a zero net revenue strategy for the government to see how the cost can be shared in a fair way to support that transition in a context where you need short-term payback times and high returns.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And Tilghman, do you have something to add to that?
Yes, there was a question, for example, on which technologies are appropriate for developing countries and what could be the role of foreign direct investment. Firstly, I think it really depends on sectors. So foreign direct investment, I would say, usually is done by multinational companies, which tend to have higher environmental standards than local companies. So there's an opportunity to transfer greener practices from rich countries to poorer countries. But then there are, of course, also exceptions. There may be investors looking for a pollution haven or so, where they have a kind of highly polluting factory and wanted to move it to some developing countries where they don't have to pay carbon taxes, for example. So it's really sector specific. And then I think it really depends on the national regulations and the way you receive this foreign direct investments. And I think there's a lot of things that can be done in negotiating with investors and setting regulatory standards. Let me give you one example. If supermarket chains like Carrefour and Tesco and Pick n Pay from South Africa so invest in low-income countries or lower middle-income countries, they do a lot of things. They have a lot of impact on the environment, bad impacts, because they bring more products and wrapped in plastics, for example. And also the plastic use per capita increases, but they also have good things, for example, and they certify where they get their fish products from, or they have renewable energy standards, and they bring in kind of labels for organic food. So there are various ways in which these investors affect the local environment positively and negatively. And I think working with these investors through regulations, but also kind of through nudges and all sorts of incentives, and say, okay, if you, whatever, Tesco, want to invest in our country, we would like to see kind of a greener performance, no? And that you have that you set targets like sourcing from local farmers, increasing the range of organic products, and sourcing energy from renewable sources, that kind of things. And I think that is the most important thing that developing countries can do with FDI. And then also about technology, I think if we talk about greening value chains, not everything is about phasing out some technologies entirely and bringing in some totally green technologies. Mostly it's about process innovations and incrementally improving the standards. No? So this is why it's why I think developing countries, negotiators have a lot of leeway of pushing investors, and that holds for all countries, rich and poor countries. Companies don't want to maximize or minimize their environmental footprint because they are used to externalizing some environmental costs. So policy is needed to give guidance and to regulate and to even ban certain things. But the best thing is always to work with the investors and nudge them to adopt increasingly greener standards.
Thank you. And Nimi, would you also like to respond?
I would like to add to the question on how can green industries bridge the gap between developing and developed countries. I think one main area that green industrialization can bridge that gap is on the area of competitiveness. So green industrialization helps developing countries to be able to reach new markets. It helps in creating, or could help in creating new value chains as well, resulting, of course, in more job creation and higher incomes. But on the other hand, when developed countries put in place green policies or green certifications or standards that need to be met, and this can be a very important trade barrier for developing countries. So developing green industrialization helps developing countries to be able to access important markets in developed countries.
Thank you, Nimi. I think we only have time for one more question, but it will be a big question, so you can think about it and then each go through with final remarks at the same time. Excuse me. So there were many questions, and we can, I'm sure, follow up afterwards around monitoring progress, some apologies, point about incentives for industry and how to engage companies. But what I wanted to ask you, and now, if my voice holds up, excuse me. No, I've got something in my throat, we're okay. Was around two things. One was the way you see and possibly the way you define green investments and how you actually say whether an industry is green or not. So can you specify? And the other thing I want you to comment on is the future trends. And of course, we've talked about a number of different trends, consumption trends, moving from more meat-based to vegetarian diets, for example, or even trends in regulation and what happens if there is no high-level pro-environmental vision at all. And so what are different roles? Are different roles changing? How maybe certification is changing as well. And the potential for greenwashing as well in terms of this area. So if there were two parts, if you can each just very briefly reflect on the way you actually define and specify what is a green industry and a green investment. And secondly, what would be your number one trend that people on the line should be looking out for? And we'll start with Andrea as well, please, to start. Thanks.
Yes. So on the definition, I think that we need to distinguish between greening the sector, so whether we're improving and making it more sustainable, and that I guess we can more or less objectively identify and define based on the performance on emissions and energy consumption and water and so on and so forth. What becomes difficult is to be subjective and really say, is this green enough? Or can I say this is in absolute terms green? That is more challenging. And that's what I say, it's really subjective. It depends on how high you set your standards, what is the local context, what is the issue with water and so on, or energy. And that goes back to the green economy definition. We cannot really say if an economy is green, period. We can say whether an economy is greener over time, it's getting greener, but there is no absolute definition of what green economy is. Again, it depends on the local context. We cannot say your economy is green if you have more than 50% of energy from renewables. Some countries cannot get there just because of natural resource endowments, and others have 90% hydro that is achieved relatively easily. So that's a bit of the challenge. And at the same time, aside from the definition, assessing the outcomes, as we talked about before, there may be rebound effects. So we may have good interventions in one area that lead to challenges in other areas. So we really need to take a systemic view to see what the consequences are of the investments we implement. And that, I would say, has to be done with full cost accounting. We look at social, economic, and environmental indicators, impact for different economic actors so that we can better frame the policies, impacts over time as well. so short, medium, and longer term for social, economic, and environmental indicators. And if we're building environmental considerations impact in space, so for any given specific location, which is where ecosystem services, for instance, will be impacted. So that I guess it's a way of framing the challenge that we have around green economy, green growth, circular economy as well. Is to a certain extent this can be objectively defined, but then there is a lot of subjectivity in how we address them and how we analyze them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, may I come in here, Tilghman? So on the definition, I think it's not that easy to really say what is green, and usually you can only talk about something is increasingly greener than what we had before. But for example, look at the issue of biofuels. For example, biofuels are green compared to fossil fuels, but they are kind of putting stress on water usage, on biodiversity, on soil fertility, etc. So you have these trade-offs between various environmental dimensions, no? And is nuclear, for example, greener than coal or greener than something else? Nuclear is clearly low carbon, but it has kind of atomic risks and nuclear radioactive pollution, etc. involved. So what is worse, carbon emissions or radioactive pollution? So I think these are value judgments that are difficult to say whether if I put biofuels in my tank, am I more concerned about biodiversity loss or about carbon emission? So I think there's a subjective thing in it, but in most cases, clearly, you can say which sectors tend to be greener than others. On the second question, what happens if you don't have a clear vision and someone driving the green agenda? And I mean, if we look around in the world, from the US to also Germany, which has been a green leader in the past, but currently is very much pro-industry and pro-polluting industry even. It's really difficult to assume that all governments are clearly drivers of the green agenda. So when you have trade-offs, in Germany we currently have the lignite mining workers, for example, lobbying for maintaining lignite exploitation, which is very harmful for the next 25 years. And their job losses there involved. So what happens if you don't have a clear vision from the top? And that's the normal case. So I think it's important to look at change agents and the lobby groups within societies that would be pushing for, that would basically gain from a greener agenda, and then to work with those coalitions. For example, if you have polluting energy utilities and clean energy utilities, you can work with the cleaner energy utilities and strengthen their role, their voice. You can allocate your credit lines, etc., provide cheaper credit lines, so the ones with a better performance. But also, I think you can work through private sector mechanisms, like, for example, developing a convincing narrative that you can only export if you're better on environmental terms than your competitors. That green really is a good investment, and that's, I think, we come back to that question. The green thing will not happen because environmental ministries or environmental movements push for it. It will only happen if the business community is convinced that the green alternative pays off. And there are certain things like investing in resource efficiency where the benefits are very clear. There are other things where the benefits will only materialize in the next 10, 15 years, and there you would need to have kind of bridging strategies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tilghman. And I think, in fact, the communities on the line and the community of the Natural Capital Coalition, for example, are already closely working together in some aspects to try and encourage that, well, basically making the business case. It's back to the business case to business, right? So that's very interesting. Thank you. And Nimi, would you like to also share your views on how you see green and what you think the biggest future trend might be.
Yeah, on the topic of what is green and not green, for me, what I like to define it more like a process. So we probably should not say this is a green industry, but rather focus more on green industrialization. So green industry or the green economy is the target that we want to get to. But we are all in this process of trying to get to that one ideal state, which perhaps we would never ever reach, but we try to get closer and closer and closer. So I think the process is more important than actually saying at the end that we have a green economy, because I think that's very difficult to prove. In terms of trends, I think we're going to see more and more of a shared economy. We're going to see more products that focus on sharing. We know about the Ubers and the Taxifys, but we are also beginning to see sharing in the household as well. We now have furniture sharing schemes. So I think in the future, we will be moving more and more into a shared economy, and more the public will start to accept this kind of trend. And I think this is the future, or one of the trends to look for in the future.
Thank you. I also realized that I didn't ask Andrea to pick up on the second part of the question, which is, what do you think the future trends are? Or what is more like the biggest, the most important trend that you see?
Actually, my apologies, it's late night here, so I forgot the second question. So instead of just looking at one trend, I would look at a pattern. I would say, the linkages between our consumption, production, and waste management as a pattern in a way. Because we're actually seeing demand increasing exponentially, with purchasing power increasing and income growing worldwide. Production increasing even faster, because now we change phones every 6 months or 1 year. We don't repair, we don't reuse products anymore. So we see even more of an exponential growth in the production side. But then we're advocating for a decline in waste generation and actually recycling reuse. So it's going to be a never-ending process if we just let things develop as they are. So we want growth on the one hand, we want a decline on the other hand. So to me, the pattern and the trend to look for is that we have a harmonized flow between consumption that is possibly declines or levels off to a certain extent on a personal level and so on. Production that is aligned with the principles of production for the consumer, not for consumerism. So it's for the utility of what you use. And then that the products are designed to ensure that more can be recycled in a more sustainable way, in a more economical way. So it's the connection between consumption, production, and waste management that I see as the main trend to look for.
Thanks, and that speaks very clearly to also a rising trend in the business community. The work that WBCSD does, for example, on circular economy is gaining a lot more traction than it was only 5 years ago. So that's great synergy. All right, so thank you very much. Thanks to the panelists. To wrap up, I would just say, I think, we were talking about, is it greener? And it made me think of the grass is always greener on the other side. And it may be that you always think that another country or another place is being greener. But in fact, what we've been saying is that it's a journey and that you can already start. And there are two main elements that have come out clearly from this webinar. One is that there are many tools and guidance out there along with the experts. But two is that there is also this network, which is incredibly powerful. I mean, in the chat, and you can go back to it afterwards to see how many people are wanting to connect, wanting to create maybe a francophone subgroup as well. There's so much energy in this area. And so with leadership and with some structure and collaboration, as is this platform, I think that the amount of progress we can make collectively by collaborating, trying not to compete too much with each other, making sure it's relevant and grounded in the reality of regulation and business, will ensure success. So with that, I'd just like to thank everyone. Once again, thank you for your comments and participation, and thanks to the Green Growth Knowledge Platform for hosting this. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Eva, for your leadership.
Thank you.